In the candlelit corridors of Ming palaces, where silk whispers louder than words and the scent of ink lingers over forgotten letters, a warrior writes in the hush before dawn. His armor rests beside him, polished but weary. Outside, the empire trembles on the edge of chaos. Inside, his heart keeps a secret, not of conquest, but of connection. In a world built on obedience, he discovers love in the eyes of another soldier. And that, history would never forgive.
Jiguang was born in 1528, during a time when the Ming Dynasty's brilliance was beginning to crack at its edges. Pirates from across the sea, the Wokou, ravaged the eastern coasts, their sails a black threat against China's maritime pride. Within the imperial court, corruption spread like dust over jade, dulling what once gleamed. Into this turbulence came a young man of discipline, intellect, and fierce loyalty, the kind of soldier poet the empire both needed and feared. He would grow to be one of China's greatest military minds. But behind the chronicles of strategy and reform, behind the marble titles and battle reports, flickered something human and dangerous. A heart that loved differently, and a time that demanded silence. The court scribes wrote of his valor. They noted his reforms, his treatises on warfare, his campaigns that pushed back the pirates and restored the empire's confidence. Yet in the private writings, in the stray verses of poetry exchanged between generals, one finds a different tone. Soft, aching, alive. The world of Ming warrior culture, though shaped by Confucian order and hierarchy, carried within it an older legacy. The ancient cut-sleeve tradition, the whisper of same-sex devotion that stretched back to emperors and scholars who found companionship in those who shared their rank, their danger, their dreams. To understand Jiguang's time is to understand a contradiction. The Ming court upheld the Confucian ideal of the upright, filial, moral man. Yet within its military and scholarly elite existed a coded acceptance of intimacy between men, seen as a bond of loyalty and refinement. It was not love, as later centuries would define it, but neither was it mere friendship. It was a communion of equals, bodies and minds fused by duty and desire. Poetry became their shield, metaphor their weapon. What could not be said outright was painted in moonlight and allegory. Jiguang, as commander of the eastern defenses, trained thousands of men, soldiers who came from villages, from poverty, from the edges of empire. He reshaped them into disciplined forces, demanding unity beyond fear. His leadership was more than strategy, it was emotional alchemy. He wrote of how a soldier must love his brother in arms as he loves his family, a phrase that carried deeper resonance than moral instruction. Within these ranks, shared hardship birthed bonds that no edict could regulate. Historians have found letters, verses, and anecdotes suggesting that among generals and officers, certain relationships, deeply affectionate, sometimes explicitly romantic, strengthened the fabric of loyalty itself.
In the coastal province of Zhejiang, where Qi was stationed during his campaigns, soldiers would often form what they called righteous brotherhoods. But the language of righteousness often concealed the language of longing. Two men would exchange objects, a belt, a lock of hair, a poem, symbolizing an unbreakable connection. It was said that before major battles, some pairs swore oaths not only of survival, but of eternal devotion, promising that if one fell, the other would live to carry his name forward. These vows, half military, half matrimonial, echoed through campfires and moonlit courtyards. Jiguang himself wrote poetry that celebrated camaraderie with unusual intimacy. One of his verses described the bond between soldiers as the iron heart that beats in another's chest. He never named his inspirations, but within the refined restraint of classical Chinese verse, silence spoke volumes. The Ming literati often used natural imagery to veil affection. Orchids for purity, bamboo for loyalty, the moon for longing. It is within these poetic codes that one can glimpse the world Qi inhabited, one where passion had to wear the mask of virtue, and where love was both weapon and wound. There are references in his writings to unnamed companions, men of valor whose presence seems to have shaped his emotional world as much as his military career. One, believed to be a fellow officer from Fujian, is described with phrases that surpass mere camaraderie. His gaze steadied my hand. His voice burned brighter than torches. Scholars debate the meaning, but the undercurrent of admiration, of intimacy, is undeniable. Qi's sensitivity, rare for a general, was not weakness. It was how he commanded hearts as well as swords. In the Ming world view, masculinity was bound by ritual and hierarchy. Yet the martial class carried an older, almost paradoxical ethos. To be a true warrior, one must know tenderness. Soldiers wrote songs of loyalty that read like love letters. Generals composed parting poems that mourned comrades with the ache of lovers. The Confucian order did not so much erase desire as sublimate it, transforming what was forbidden into something sacred through the language of loyalty. This was how queer intimacy survived, not in open defiance, but in transformation, in disguise. Qi's story unfolds not as a scandal, but as a study of what love looks like under repression. When desire cannot name itself, it becomes devotion. When passion is silenced, it becomes poetry. His leadership thrived on this understanding. He saw that to inspire men to fight, one must first make them feel seen. There is a recorded moment in his military treatise, Ji Shao Xin Shu, where he writes of discipline founded not on fear, but on trust. A commander who shares the hearts of his men, he says, can lead them through the gates of death. That sharing of hearts was not metaphorical alone. It was an echo of something deeply personal.
In the hushed corridors of a Ming fortress, where moonlight touched the edges of lacquered armor and the scent of ink mingled with sweat, history held its breath. Power, loyalty, and desire, three forces that shaped empires, often lived in the same shadow. And in that shadow, in the 16th century, a general named Jiguang carved his legend not only in blood and steel, but in a tenderness history dared not name. In a world of banners and drums, where men swore oaths louder than their hearts could whisper, some loves were spoken only through the tightening of a grip, the brush of a sleeve, or the quiet promise of eyes meeting before battle. Jiguang was born in 1528, during a time when the Ming Dynasty's brilliance was beginning to crack at its edges. Pirates from across the sea, the Wokou, ravaged the eastern coasts, their sails a black threat against China's maritime pride. Within the imperial court, corruption spread like dust over jade, dulling what once gleamed. Into this turbulence came a young man of discipline, intellect, and fierce loyalty, the kind of soldier-poet the empire both needed and feared. He would grow to be one of China's greatest military minds. But behind the chronicles of strategy and reform, behind the marble titles and battle reports, flickered something human and dangerous, a heart that loved differently in a time that demanded silence. The court scribes wrote of his valor. They noted his reforms, his treatises on warfare, his campaigns that pushed back the pirates and restored the empire's confidence. Yet in the private writings, in the stray verses of poetry exchanged between generals, one finds a different tone, soft, aching, alive. The world of Ming warrior culture, though shaped by Confucian order and hierarchy, carried within it an older legacy, the ancient cut-sleeve tradition, the whisper of same-sex devotion that stretched back to emperors and scholars who found companionship in those who shared their rank, their danger, their dreams. To understand Jiguang's time is to understand a contradiction. The Ming court upheld the Confucian ideal of the upright, filial, moral man. Yet within its military and scholarly elite existed a coded acceptance of intimacy between men, seen as a bond of loyalty and refinement. It was not love as later centuries would define it, but neither was it mere friendship. It was a communion of equals, bodies and minds fused by duty and desire. Poetry became their shield, metaphor their weapon. What could not be said outright was painted in moonlight and allegory. Jiguang, as commander of the eastern defenses, trained thousands of men, soldiers who came from villages, from poverty, from the edges of empire. He reshaped them into disciplined forces, demanding unity beyond fear. His leadership was more than strategy, it was emotional alchemy. He wrote of how a soldier must love his brother in arms as he loves his family, a phrase that carried deeper resonance than moral instruction. Within these ranks, shared hardship birthed bonds that no edict could regulate. Historians have found letters, verses, and anecdotes suggesting that among generals and officers, certain relationships, deeply affectionate, sometimes explicitly romantic, strengthened the fabric of loyalty itself.
Imagine the coastal camps in twilight, the clang of weapons fading, the sea wind licking the banners, the soldiers gathering in pairs or small groups to drink weak wine and recite poetry. Somewhere, Qi sits among his officers, his hair unbound, his armor loosened, laughter softening the edge of war. A friend, perhaps his most trusted lieutenant, pours him a cup. Their hands touch briefly. In that gesture lies the entire fragility of their world. They cannot speak of love, but they live it in every shared danger, every glance that lasts too long. The empire is vast, but their secret world exists in a single heartbeat. These unrecorded affections formed the invisible architecture of power. When soldiers marched under Qi's command, they did so bound by more than orders. They were bound by feeling. This was not unique to him. Throughout Chinese history, the concept of male-male affection within ranks carried complex meanings, from the Han emperor's cut-sleeve lovers to the poets of Tang who celebrated Duanqi Zuai. Same-sex bonds were alternately accepted, idealized, or quietly tolerated depending on the political climate. What makes Qi's time remarkable is how these affections became intertwined with military reform. Loyalty was not abstract, it was personal. But such intimacy could not escape tension. The Confucian hierarchy demanded balance. Every relationship had to reinforce social order. Love between men was acceptable only if it maintained decorum, only if it did not threaten lineage, inheritance, or imperial control. So even as these generals shared hearts and oaths, they lived under the gaze of tradition. Marriage to women was compulsory for status, lineage was duty, and so their true loves, if they existed, were consigned to shadows. History, written by the victors and the virtuous, would later erase such nuances. Qi Yuzhikang's legend grew, his victory is multiplying. The emperor praised him, scholars chronicled his reforms. He became the ideal Confucian general, brave, disciplined, loyal to the throne. But the poetry persisted, lingering like a trace of smoke after the ritual fire. In later years, when he retired to his estate, his writings turned inward, filled with reflection and melancholy. He wrote, "In peace, the sword grows dull, but the heart remembers what it cannot hold." Those words, simple yet devastating, could refer to lost comrades, or to something more intimate, unspoken. In the silence between those lines lives the entire untold history of Ming queerness, a history not of rebellion, but of endurance. Men like Qi lived in a paradox, celebrated as paragons of virtue while carrying forbidden tenderness in their chests. Their love stories, hidden beneath layers of ritual and verse, survived precisely because they were never named. That is the beauty and the tragedy of their world. The same society that demanded silence also gave them the tools, poetry, ritual, loyalty, to keep that silence alive with meaning. The night deepens. The fortress fades into memory. Somewhere between history and rumor, between poetry and truth, Qi Jiguang stands, a man of empire and emotion, power and vulnerability. The battles he fought were not only against pirates or politics, but against the limits of what his heart could confess. And yet, in every verse, every act of brotherhood,
Every fragment of feeling he left behind, his truth endures. History called him a hero, but perhaps in the quiet of his final years, he hoped to be remembered as something rarer, a man who loved as fiercely as he fought. The sound of the forge never ceased in the eastern provinces. Sparks rose like fireflies into the night, casting the faces of young soldiers in gold and shadow. It was said that Jiguang could tell a man's heart by the way he held his sword, not by strength, but by steadiness. To him, discipline was not brutality, it was devotion. He shaped farmers into fighters, thieves into tacticians, and wanderers into a brotherhood bound by something deeper than obedience. They called themselves the Jiao men, but among one another they spoke of their bond as a quiet oath, to live together, to die together, to remember one another even when the empire forgot their names. Qi's military reforms were revolutionary, but it was the emotional fabric of his army that made it invincible. When he led his men into battle against the Wokou pirates, he fought beside them, not from the safety of command tents, but shoulder to shoulder in the mud and blood of the coast. He carried no air of distance, no reminder of superiority. To them, he was not just general, he was brother. The chronicles speak of the way he would walk through the rows of tents at night, pausing to share tea or to listen to the fears of those too young to sleep. He taught that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to protect one another despite it. Those who stood nearest to him would later describe how his gaze lingered on certain men, not lustful, but intimate, as though recognizing a part of himself reflected in them. His closest aide, the officer Tang, seemed to hold a place beyond mere companionship. Their partnership, though unspoken, was felt by those around them. Tang accompanied Qi on every major campaign, and when he was wounded in battle, Qi is said to have refused food until he recovered. In a time where emotion was weakness, such acts whispered of a loyalty that defied decorum. When Tang returned to the battlefield, still bandaged, he stood beside Qi during the decisive campaign at Taizhou. The chronicles record that Qi led his men with tears of fire, watching his soldiers fall, calling each by name. After victory, he wrote a poem describing the sea turned red and hearts still unbroken. The poem, once archived in his personal collection, was later censored for being too sentimental for war. But the fragments that survive are unmistakably personal. They carry grief, love, and the ache of someone who has seen beauty and loss fused into the same breath. The Ming Dynasty prided itself on moral rigidity, on hierarchy, filial duty, and restraint. But on the battlefield, where life and death blurred the lines of propriety, men created their own codes. Bonds between soldiers were not only tolerated, but quietly encouraged, as long as they served the empire's stability. What was forbidden in court became necessary in war. Love disguised itself as loyalty. Tenderness cloaked itself as comradeship. It was a performance both honest and necessary, and in that delicate act of concealment, humanity survived. Qi's writings on military discipline reveal this philosophy. He wrote that a soldier's heart is a blade. To temper it, you must heat it with compassion. In another, he urged commanders to lead with kindness, for fear fractures where love unites. These were not the words of a typical Ming general. They were the confessions of a man who understood that order built on cruelty collapses, but loyalty born of affection endures. Modern historians read these passages as metaphor, but those who have studied his personal notes find traces of intimacy threaded between the lessons, an understanding that connection between men was not a weakness, but a form of power. On quiet nights, when the sea winds softened and the campfires dimmed, Qi would write. His brush moved with the rhythm of thought, steady, restrained,
but alive. Some of his poetry survives only in partial lines, rescued from later editions of his Jixiao Xinshu, the military manual that immortalized his strategies. Between descriptions of formations and drills, there are verses that seem misplaced, as if slipped in by accident. One reads, "We share the same sky, though distance divides. If I fall, guard my name within your heart." For a man so precise, so deliberate, such lines could not have been unintentional. They reveal a softness that no armor could hide. When the war finally turned in his favor and peace returned to the eastern shores, Qi was celebrated as a hero. But in the silence that followed victory, he seemed uneasy. He no longer wrote of triumph, he wrote of ghosts. His journals from those years describe a haunting solitude, a longing for the camaraderie that once gave his life rhythm. It is in these writings that we glimpse the emotional cost of his command, how the same bonds that gave him strength also became his undoing. The empire moved on, the soldiers disbanded, their names lost to bureaucratic indifference. But in the private recesses of Qi's memory, they lived on. The laughter in the tents, the quiet promises made under the hum of cicadas, and the handshakes that lingered too long. He once wrote, "The greatest sorrow of peace is forgetting the faces that made it possible." For a man revered for his discipline, such sentiment was dangerous, even subversive, but it was also profoundly human. As the years passed, Qi's political fortunes waned. Enemies at court accused him of arrogance, of fraternizing too freely with his men, of blurring the lines of propriety. The Confucian elite found his compassion suspicious. They preferred generals who ruled with fear, not empathy. Rumors spread, whispers of impropriety, of favoritism toward certain officers. None were proven, but the stain lingered. Qi was gradually pushed out of favor, his titles reduced, his influence stripped away. He retired to his estate in Shandong, far from the capital's intrigues. It was there, in his final solitude, that he wrote his most enigmatic poems. In them, the themes of battle fade, replaced by remembrance and loss. He spoke not of empire, but of souls intertwined beyond time. One of his last surviving works reads, "When the waves erase our footprints, will the wind still remember our names?" Some scholars interpret this as a reflection on mortality, others on loyalty, but to those who read between the lines, it sounds like a love letter, one written to the countless unnamed men who followed him, who lived and died for something greater than duty. There is no evidence that Qi ever married for love. He wed, as all men of his rank did, for family honor and lineage. His wife, Lady Wang, is scarcely mentioned in his records. What is written, instead, obsessively, vividly, are the bonds of his comrades, the virtues of those who stood beside him, the grief of losing them. The emotional center of his world, it seems, was never the domestic hearth, but the brotherhood he forged in war. In the centuries that followed, his story was cleansed of its humanity. The Qing dynasty turned him into a symbol of stoic patriotism, his poetry rewritten, his tenderness erased. Yet fragments survived in regional anthologies and private letters. One such fragment, discovered in the archives of Fuzhou, describes a dream. "He came to me again, in the scent of rain. I reached for his hand, but the dawn took him away." The handwriting, aged and uncertain, is believed to be Qi's. If it is, then the dream was likely of Tang, his most trusted companion. Tang's death date remains unknown, but local records suggest he died before Qi's retirement.
The loss might explain the melancholy that stains Qi's later works, the ache of a man who had seen too much, loved too deeply, and been forced to bury both memory and feeling beneath the weight of propriety. In every dynasty, there are stories the empire cannot tell. Love between men, especially among the powerful, was both an open secret and a buried truth. The Ming elite might have tolerated whispers of it among poets, but never among generals. For a warrior like Jiguang to embody such tenderness was dangerous. It threatened to rewrite what strength meant. Yet that is precisely what he did. He redefined valor as care and power as compassion. In his silence, he preserved a truth that history tried to erase. Today, his name appears in textbooks as the savior of the Eastern Coast, the strategist who modernized China's defenses. But beyond the formal portraits and military manuals, a quieter portrait exists, one painted in poetry and memory. It is the image of a man standing by the sea, watching the tide carry away everything he built, and whispering the names of those he once called brothers, lovers, and friends. He died in 1588, the same year the Spanish Armada sailed westward, a coincidence that reminds us how small the world's distances truly are. His body was laid to rest with full honors, but his heart remained in the songs of the soldiers who once followed him. Legends say that on certain fog-bound nights along the Fujian coast, old fishermen still sing verses from his poems, words about loyalty, courage, and the ache of parting. They do not know their author's name, but the emotion endures, unchanged by centuries. History will always debate what cannot be proven, but the human soul does not require evidence to recognize itself. In Jiguang's story, we find not scandal, but truth, that the deepest bonds are forged not in power, but in vulnerability. The brotherhood he built was more than military genius. It was the quiet rebellion of men who loved in the only way the world would allow, with swords in their hands and silence on their tongues. And though time has buried their names beneath marble and dust, their echo remains. It hums through the corridors of every forgotten palace and along every ruined battlement. The empire may have claimed their loyalty, but their love, wordless, enduring, indestructible, belonged only to themselves.
The Ming court glittered like a mirror catching sunlight, dazzling from afar, but cracked beneath its sheen. Within the Forbidden City, courtiers moved like pieces in a game no one could afford to lose. Every gesture, every bow, every word carried the weight of politics and the whisper of danger. It was an age when silence could be a weapon sharper than any sword. For men like Jiguang, loyalty was both armor and chain. Behind the measured courtesy and the rituals of obeisance, unseen wars of emotion and survival raged quietly beneath the dragon banner of the empire. Jiguang's rise had brought him close to the heart of power, yet proximity to the throne was never safe. His reforms, his popularity with the troops, his reputation for incorruptible discipline, all drew suspicion. In the Ming system, the emperor's favor was both blessing and burden. The same devotion that made Qi beloved among his soldiers made him a threat to courtiers who thrived on intrigue. There were rumors, whispered, fleeting, that his bond with certain officers was too close, that he cultivated affection where only obedience should grow. Such talk, veiled in moral judgment, was never spoken openly, but it lingered like smoke in the air, impossible to grasp, impossible to dispel. In the Confucian imagination, the empire was a family, and the emperor its father. To serve the father meant to uphold virtue, propriety, and restraint. But under that ideology lived 1,000 quiet rebellions. Within the garrisons and academies, among poets and strategists, there persisted a culture of intimacy that blurred the lines of propriety. Letters exchanged under the pretext of military consultation carried undertones of longing. Poems celebrating friendship pulsed with double meanings. What history later reduced to fraternity may once have been something far more alive, far more dangerous. Jiguang's writings from his middle years reveal a subtle change. The optimism of youth fades, the poetry grows heavier, the metaphors sharper. He writes of loyalty that costs more than life, of trust betrayed by envy, of the ache of unspoken truths. When the wind turns, one line reads, the candle trembles not for fear, but for memory. It is the language of a man learning that not all enemies wear armor. Within his command, the bonds he cultivated among men were the source of both his strength and his peril. A general who loved his soldiers too deeply could be accused of partiality. One who shared hearts as well as commands risked the emperor's suspicion. To preserve his image, Qi began to withdraw into formality, concealing emotion beneath ritual. His poetry remained, but it now hid behind layers of illusion. Birds calling across valleys, rivers dividing but never forgetting their shared source. The metaphors became fortresses of feeling.
Among the officers who served under him, a few names appear repeatedly in his writings, not in official records, but in fragments, dedications, marginal notes. One in particular, an aide known only by his courtesy name, Jung, is mentioned with uncommon tenderness. In the stillness before dawn, Qi wrote, Jung speaks of duty as if it were love. Scholars cannot confirm who this man was. The archives do not preserve his full name. But perhaps that anonymity is its own story. Many such companions were erased by design, folded into the collective, their individuality sacrificed to history's decorum. Yet their absence only amplifies the resonance of the words left behind. The Ming elite understood the language of disguise. Desire had to dress as virtue. Affection had to borrow the language of philosophy. When Qi praised the discipline and devotion of his men, he spoke as a Confucian leader. But beneath the rhetoric lay the pulse of something far more human. He wrote of how men must live as one spirit, even if divided by 1,000 miles. Such unity was both military necessity and emotional metaphor. To modern ears, it is difficult to separate loyalty from love, and perhaps in his world, the two were inseparable. As his career advanced, court politics turned darker. Accusations of corruption spread, not against him directly, but against his allies. The eunuch factions in Beijing grew powerful, whispering that Qi's methods were too unconventional, his discipline too harsh, his loyalty too absolute. In 1585, he was recalled, questioned, humiliated in bureaucratic audits designed to break the spirit of men too independent for the empire's liking. His health declined. Friends who once swore eternal brotherhood began to distance themselves. History, cold and pragmatic, often turns its back on the hearts that built it. Yet even in exile, Qi wrote. His letters from his final years are meditations on impermanence, on how devotion survives betrayal, how affection outlives formality. He said, a soldier without battle is like a heart without purpose, but to fight for what is unspoken, that is the hardest campaign of all. In these words, the line between military philosophy and emotional confession blurs completely. Beneath the armor of a loyal general beats the heart of a man who has lost something, or someone, the world would not allow him to name. The Ming Dynasty prized order above all else. To maintain the illusion of harmony, it erased contradictions, buried ambiguities, and silenced those who did not fit neatly into its hierarchies. But human feeling has always been more fluid than law. In the shadows of temples and barracks, under lanterns that burned low after curfew, men and women found ways to remember each other, through poetry, through calligraphy, through small tokens carried into battle or hidden in sleeves. The empire's power rested on obedience,
Yet its humanity depended on those quiet acts of disobedience, those whispers beneath the dragon banner that refused to die.
Jiguang died in 1588, the same year the sea once more turned restless, as if the world were exhaling his story into memory. He left behind manuals on warfare, strategies still studied centuries later, and poems that no one dared to fully interpret. Officially, he was remembered as a paragon of loyalty, a Confucian hero who embodied discipline and virtue. But in the unspoken lines, in the tenderness of his metaphors, a different man survives, one who knew that love and duty can inhabit the same body, that courage is not only found in battlefields, but also in the quiet endurance of a heart that cannot speak its truth. The chronicles never mention his companions again. Their names vanish, their faces dissolve into the anonymity of the empire's archives. But their presence lingers, in the way Qi wrote about devotion, in the gentleness that colors even his strictest commands. His legacy is not only the fortresses he built, or the pirates he repelled, but the emotional architecture he left within the Chinese imagination. The idea that loyalty, in its purest form, can be a form of love. Centuries later, scholars would return to his poetry and sense something elusive, a tenderness that defied its age. They would trace the metaphors of moonlight and memory, trying to decode the silences. Some would dismiss them as literary convention. Others would recognize them as echoes of a hidden world. For in every empire, the official story is only half the truth. The other half lies in whispers, in the faint scratches of a brush across silk, in the sighs left between lines, in the knowledge that, even under the watchful gaze of the dragon throne, love still found its way into the cracks of history. Under that vast imperial sky, the banners have long since fallen. The battles are dust. But somewhere, perhaps, the spirit of those who loved in secret still stirs with the wind that moves across the old fortresses of Zhejiang. And in that wind, one might still hear a voice, calm, steady, unafraid, saying that the heart, like the empire, endures by remembering what it once dared to feel.
Centuries passed, and the winds that once carried the cries of battle softened into whispers across the old stone walls of the Ming fortresses. The name Jiguang endured, polished into legend by generations of scholars and soldiers. His manuals on war became classics of discipline and patriotism, his reforms a template for order. Yet beneath that polished image, something far more fragile remained, a lingering warmth, like the faint glow of embers hidden beneath ash. The world remembered his victories, but not his silences. And yet, silence itself can hold a legacy. In the poetry he left behind, historians found not only strategy but soul. There are verses that linger with a softness that seems out of place in a warrior's pen. They speak of loyalty that transcends the grave, of eyes that haunt memory, of comrades who walk beside me even in absence. It is in these words that the heart of Jiguang still beats, not as a conqueror, but as a man who knew that strength and tenderness can coexist. His empire has long since crumbled, but his emotional world remains suspended between myth and truth, waiting to be read anew. The Ming Dynasty's society has often been described as rigid, a lattice of duty and ritual. Yet within that structure, people found infinite ways to express the unnameable. Desire wore the robes of discipline, affection hid within metaphors of loyalty. Even when history refused to record them, the gestures of love, a poem exchanged, a promise whispered before battle, a gaze that lingered too long, carried forward like seeds through centuries. This was how queer stories survived, not through open rebellion, but through quiet persistence. In the centuries after Qi's death, the cut-sleeve tradition faded into euphemism, its once celebrated tales buried under the tightening grip of moral orthodoxy. Western colonial narratives would later label same-sex love as foreign corruption, while local historians, eager to defend national virtue, erased traces of queer identity from ancient texts. But history has a way of resisting silence. In the modern age, as scholars revisited old manuscripts with new eyes, they began to see what was always there: the coded languages, the tenderness disguised as virtue, the humanity hidden beneath ceremony. Jiguang's story belongs to that rediscovery. His life reminds us that queerness did not arrive in China from elsewhere, nor was it born in rebellion alone. It existed within its own traditions, in poetry, philosophy, and the human longing for connection. When he wrote of comrades whose loyalty outlived war, he was also describing a love that transcended permission. His devotion, wrapped in the vocabulary of discipline, becomes an early testament to a truth that societies have often tried to deny: that love, in all its forms, strengthens rather than weakens.
To read Jiguang today is to stand between two mirrors, one reflecting the past's grandeur, the other our own search for belonging. The soldier's oaths he once inspired echo in the struggles of those who now seek to live openly. The poetry that once masked affection in coded imagery speaks to anyone who has ever hidden a part of themselves to survive. Across centuries, the same question lingers: how much of ourselves must we conceal to remain safe within the empires we inhabit? In the quiet study rooms of historians, in classrooms, in the flicker of documentaries and retellings, his story finds new listeners. Artists and scholars begin to reinterpret the old verses, reading them not as mere military allegory, but as the emotional architecture of a man navigating forbidden tenderness. In the act of remembrance, Ji is no longer only a general of the Ming. He becomes a symbol of what queer love has always been: disciplined by necessity, but endless in spirit. His emotional world also invites us to rethink power itself. The empire demanded obedience, but his life showed that devotion could never be controlled. His soldiers followed him because he understood their hearts. He treated emotion not as weakness, but as strength. Even when the court turned against him, when accusations sought to strip him of dignity, he held fast to compassion. That compassion, quiet, steadfast, unrecorded, became his truest legacy. The walls of his fortresses may have fallen, but the empathy he practiced became a lasting monument. There is a strange comfort in knowing that his story, once reduced to military legend, can now breathe again through the lens of love. The whispers that once hid behind formality now speak with a gentler courage. They tell us that history is not just a chain of battles and decrees, it is also a gallery of human hearts, each beating against the limits of its time. For every emperor who banned affection, there were countless souls who kept it alive in their silence. The rediscovery of figures like Jiguang matters because it repairs something larger than biography. It reminds us that queer history is not an interruption of tradition, it is part of it. The poetry of longing, the coded metaphors, the devotion between soldiers and scholars all form a continuous thread that stretches through dynasties and revolutions, through the present day. When we read his words now, we are not uncovering scandal, but reclaiming continuity, the truth that love has always existed in every empire, even when it had to hide its name. Somewhere in the modern imagination, T stands again, not as a marble statue of obedience, but as a man whose heart still flickers with quiet fire. His story speaks to those who carry unspoken desires, to those who have learned to express love through small acts of courage. His silence becomes a mirror, reflecting both the repression of his time and the resilience of all who came after. He shows that the greatest victories are not always those won in battlefields, but in the private wars we wage against fear. As dusk settles over the old coastal forts he once guarded, one can almost feel the sea breeze carry fragments of his words, fragments that survived centuries of censorship and indifference. The wind murmurs through broken stone, and the sound is like a heartbeat remembering its rhythm. That is the legacy of the hidden flame. It may fade, but it never dies. It glows quietly in each new retelling, in every scholar's rediscovery, in every viewer who sees themselves reflected in a history they were told did not exist. Jiguang's story belongs not only to the past, but to the living struggle for truth. It tells us that identity, even when silenced, finds ways to endure. Through art, through friendship, through memory. His life, with all its discipline and restraint, becomes a testament to how love survives in the unlikeliest places. In poetry disguised as loyalty, in duty that conceals devotion, in a history that learns, slowly, to speak its whole heart again. If stories like this stir something within you, help us bring more hidden truths into the light. Like, share, and subscribe to Crowned Secrets, where forgotten LGBTQ+ voices from royal courts and political halls rise again. Because history's quietest hearts deserve to be heard.